Hi everyone, my name is Mark, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Kristy Hunt first met Kenneth Ray Manzanares when they were both teenagers, attending East Carbon High School in the small mining town of East Carbon, Utah. Kenneth was an athletic young man who played football, wrestled, and boxed throughout his childhood and teenage years. Kristy was born on October 30th, 1977 in Salt Lake City, Utah, to Jeff and Karee Hunt. Kristy grew up in Sunnyside, a small community in Carbon County, Utah, where she developed a love for riding her bike to the swimming pool with her faithful dog, Cinder. She was an active student at East Carbon High School, participating in numerous sports and clubs. She was a first-place winner at the Utah State FCCLA competition and earned recognition as a sterling scholar in family and consumer science. She was named Ms. Viking of her graduating class of 1996. Kenneth couldn't help but be drawn to Kristy's infectious personality and beautiful smile. She had a way of making everyone around her feel important and special, putting a smile on their faces wherever she went. Kenneth was the strong, athletic type, while Kristy was the bright, academically gifted student with a warm and compassionate soul that drew people to her naturally. After graduating from high school, their relationship continued to blossom as they both pursued their individual dreams and goals. Kristy earned her associate's degree at the College of Eastern Utah before transferring to Southern Utah University, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Family and Consumer Science with an emphasis in interior design. Kenneth explored various career opportunities, including work that would eventually lead him to manage a Walgreens pharmacy and later work as a bail bondsman. Despite their different career paths, their love for each other remained strong and unwavering. On August 27, 1999, Kenneth and Kristy celebrated their love in a wedding ceremony that marked the beginning of what many believed would be a lifetime of happiness together. Their marriage was blessed with 3 beautiful daughters who became the absolute center of Kristy's universe. Kaylee, their oldest daughter, was born with autism and cerebral palsy. Cameron, nicknamed Cammy, was their middle daughter, and Kaya was their youngest. Her daughters were truly the light of her life, and she always went above and beyond for her girls. As the years passed, Kristy established herself as a successful professional in the St. George area. She worked as a design consultant before becoming an extremely successful real estate agent, working for Summit Sotheby's Real Estate. She was an important member of the St. George area real estate community, serving as the chairwoman of the Programs and Socials Committee for the Washington County Board of Realtors. Throughout their marriage, Kenneth and Kristy appeared to be living the American dream. They had built a beautiful life together in Santa Clara, Utah, a quiet community where they were beloved members of their neighborhood and local church. Kenneth worked various jobs over the years, always trying to provide for his growing family, while Kristy balanced her successful career with being a devoted mother to their 3 daughters. However, beneath the surface of what appeared to be a perfect marriage, there were signs that not everything was as idyllic as it seemed. Kenneth had a history of anger issues that occasionally manifested in concerning ways. According to court documents, Kenneth had admitted to breaking TV remotes when he became angry, punching holes in walls during fits of rage, and physically restraining his wife during arguments. These incidents would later be seen as warning signs of the violence that was building beneath the surface. Kenneth had been dealing with undiagnosed bipolar disorder for years, a condition that remained hidden and untreated throughout much of their marriage. This mental health condition, combined with the lingering effects of numerous concussions and brain injuries he had sustained during his years of playing contact sports, created a dangerous combination. In the months leading up to the tragic events, Kenneth had been taking a problematic combination of medications that included Adderall, testosterone supplements, amphetamine-like weight loss drugs, opioid pain medication, and medication for erectile dysfunction. This cocktail of prescription drugs, combined with alcohol consumption, created a volatile situation. Despite these underlying issues, Kristy remained committed to her marriage and her family. By 2017, Kenneth and Kristy had been married for 18 years. To the outside world, they still appeared to be a loving couple who had successfully built a life together and raised 3 daughters. Their friends and family members would later say they never saw any signs of serious trouble between the couple, and that the events that were about to unfold were completely shocking and unexpected. In July 2017, Kenneth and Kristy decided to take what was intended to be a celebration of their love and commitment to each other. They planned an Alaskan cruise aboard the Emerald Princess, a luxurious cruise ship that would take them through some of the most beautiful scenery in North America. This trip was meant to commemorate their upcoming wedding anniversary and provide them with an opportunity to reconnect and enjoy quality time together, away from the stresses of their daily lives. The couple was not traveling alone on this special anniversary cruise. Kristy's parents, Jeff and Karee Hunt, joined them for the journey, along with Kristy's two brothers, Dallas and Cody Hunt. All three of Kenneth and Kristy's daughters, Kaylee, Cameron, and Kaya, were also part of the cruise party, making it a true family celebration. On July 24, 2017, the family boarded the Emerald Princess in Seattle, Washington, filled with anticipation for the adventure that lay ahead. The Manzanares family settled into their accommodations, with Kenneth and Kristy sharing cabin D726, a 323-square-foot stateroom located on Deck 9 toward the stern of the ship. However, by the evening of July 25, 2017, the second day of their cruise, things began to take a troubling turn. The cruise ship was traveling toward Juneau, Alaska, sailing through the outside waters of the Alaskan coast, within the special maritime and territorial waters of the United States. The family had planned to enjoy dinner together that evening, but Kenneth's behavior during the meal became increasingly problematic and concerning to those around him. According to witnesses and court documents that would later be filed, Kenneth had been drinking alcohol during dinner and began behaving inappropriately toward his wife. He started forcibly kissing Kristy against her wishes in front of their family members and other passengers in the dining room. This behavior was not only uncomfortable for Kristy, but also deeply embarrassing and upsetting for their daughters and extended family members who were witnessing Kenneth's inappropriate actions. Kristy's discomfort with her husband's behavior was evident to everyone present, and she tried to discourage his advances without creating a scene. However, Kenneth seemed oblivious to her discomfort and continued his inappropriate behavior despite her obvious reluctance. The situation became so uncomfortable that one of Kristy's brothers, feeling protective of his sister, got into an argument with Kenneth about his unacceptable conduct. The confrontation between Kenneth and Kristy's brother created tension at the dinner table that was palpable to everyone present. Feeling embarrassed and wanting to avoid a public scene, Kenneth and Kristy made the decision to leave the dining room and return to their cabin. What should have been a pleasant family dinner celebrating their anniversary cruise had instead become an uncomfortable and tense situation that left everyone feeling uneasy about what might happen next. Once Kenneth and Kristy reached their cabin, they were joined by two of their daughters, creating what should have been a private family space where they could address the issues that had arisen during dinner. However, instead of calming down and discussing the situation rationally, Kenneth's behavior continued to escalate in ways that would prove to be catastrophic for their entire family. At approximately 8:50 p.m., the situation in cabin D726 reached a breaking point. Kenneth and Kristy became involved in a heated verbal argument about Kenneth's inappropriate behavior during dinner. The conversation quickly escalated as Kristy expressed her frustration and disappointment with her husband's conduct. She had been embarrassed by his actions in front of their children and extended family, and she was not willing to simply ignore what had happened. During this intense argument, Kristy reached a moment of clarity about her marriage and her future. With a heavy heart, and after years of dealing with Kenneth's increasingly problematic behavior, she made a decision that would have profound consequences. She told Kenneth that she wanted a divorce and demanded that he disembark the vessel when it reached Juneau the following day so that he could travel back home to Utah alone. This was not a decision she had made lightly, but she felt it was necessary for her own well-being and that of their daughters. Kenneth's reaction to Kristy's announcement was immediate and alarming. Realizing that his daughters were witnessing this confrontation between their parents, he told them to leave the room immediately. Both girls obediently left their parents' cabin and went into an adjoining cabin where their grandparents and other family members were staying. They had no way of knowing that they had just witnessed the last normal moments of their mother's life. Just a few minutes after the daughters had left the cabin, the situation took a horrifying turn. The girls, who were in the adjoining cabin with their grandparents, suddenly heard their mother scream in a way that filled them with terror and dread. They immediately attempted to re-enter their parents' cabin using the adjoining door that connected the two rooms, desperate to help their mother and understand what was happening. However, when they tried to open the door, they heard their father's voice telling them, "Don't come in here." His tone was alarming and unlike anything they had ever heard from him before. Filled with fear and confusion, the girls made a desperate decision to try to see what was happening to their mother by going to the connected balcony that adjoined both cabins. What they witnessed through the sliding glass doors of their parents' cabin would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They saw their father, Kenneth, Straddling their mother, Kristy, who was lying on the bed, Kenneth was striking her repeatedly in the head with his closed fists, delivering blow after blow with a violence that was beyond anything they could have imagined. The girls banged frantically on the window, pleading with their father to stop assaulting their mother, their voices filled with desperation and terror. Kenneth heard his daughter's pleas and turned to look at them through the glass doors. For a moment, his eyes met theirs, and they could see something in his expression that they had never seen before. A look that was cold and terrifying. But instead of stopping his assault on their mother, Kenneth turned back to Kristy and continued the brutal beating, showing no mercy or recognition of the horror he was inflicting not only on his wife, but on his own children, who were forced to witness this unthinkable violence. The scene was gruesome beyond description. Kenneth was using his fists like hammers, delivering blow after blow to Kristy's head and face with an unrelenting ferocity that suggested he had completely lost control of himself. The violence was so extreme and sustained that it would later be described by prosecutors as one of the most brutal assaults they had ever encountered in their careers. Realizing that their father was not going to stop and that their mother was in grave danger, one of the daughters ran from the balcony to alert other family members who were elsewhere on the ship. She ran through the corridors of the cruise ship, her voice filled with panic as she called for help, telling anyone who would listen that her parents were in a fight and that her mother needed immediate assistance. Dallas Hunt, one of Kristy's brothers who had argued with Kenneth at dinner, was among the first family members to respond to the frantic calls for help. He immediately made his way to Kenneth and Kristy's cabin, using his key to try to gain entry. However, when he attempted to use the cabin key, it would not work, suggesting that Kenneth had somehow secured the door from the inside to prevent anyone from entering and stopping his assault. Realizing that he needed to get into the cabin immediately to help his sister, Dallas made the desperate decision to climb from his own balcony onto Kenneth and Kristy's balcony. This dangerous maneuver was his only option for reaching Kristy quickly, and he was willing to risk his own safety to try to save his sister's life. When Dallas finally managed to get into the cabin, he was confronted with a scene of violence and horror that would be forever etched in his memory. Kristy was lying motionless on the floor, covered in blood, with injuries so severe that she was barely recognizable as the vibrant, beautiful woman she had been just minutes earlier. Kenneth was still in the cabin, and there was blood on his hands and clothing, evidence of the brutal assault he had just committed against his wife. Upon Dallas's arrival in the cabin, Kenneth's behavior became even more alarming and bizarre. Instead of showing remorse or attempting to help his severely injured wife, Kenneth grabbed Kristy's motionless body and began dragging her toward the balcony. Federal prosecutors would later theorize that Kenneth was attempting to dispose of his wife's body by throwing her overboard into the ocean, which would have made it appear as though she had fallen or jumped from the ship. Dallas immediately recognized the danger of Kenneth's actions and sprang into action to prevent him from carrying out what appeared to be an attempt to cover up his crime. He grabbed his sister's ankles and pulled her back into the cabin, engaging in a physical struggle with Kenneth to prevent him from throwing Kristy's body over the railing and into the dark waters below. During this confrontation, Kenneth made a statement that would later be cited in court documents as evidence of his consciousness of guilt. When asked what had happened to Kristy, Kenneth reportedly said, "She would not stop laughing at me." This response suggested that Kenneth believed Kristy had been mocking or ridiculing him, though there was no evidence to support this perception, and it appeared to be a product of his deteriorating mental state. As the struggle between Kenneth and Dallas continued, other family members began arriving at the cabin. Kristy's father, Jeff Hunt, rushed to the scene and attempted to render aid to his daughter. However, when he saw the extent of her injuries, it was immediately apparent that Kristy was not going to survive. She was not breathing and had no pulse, and the trauma to her head and face was so severe that she was completely unrecognizable. The beating had been so violent and sustained that Kristy had suffered multiple skull fractures and blunt force trauma to her head and face that proved to be fatal. The injuries were consistent with Kenneth having used his fists as weapons, delivering dozens of blows with the force and impact of a hammer. The violence was so extreme that Kristy would later be buried following a closed casket funeral because her injuries made it impossible for her family to have an open casket service. During these chaotic moments, Kristy's youngest daughter, Kaya, arrived back at the cabin after having run to get help from other family members. When she saw the scene inside the cabin, she asked her father where her mother was. Kenneth's response was chilling in its callousness. He simply pointed to the floor where Kristy's lifeless body lay, showing no emotion or remorse for what he had done. Little Kaya, not fully understanding the gravity of what had happened, but knowing that her mother was hurt, sat down on the floor next to Kristy and held her until medical personnel arrived. This heartbreaking image of a young daughter holding her fatally injured mother while waiting for help would become one of the most tragic aspects of an already horrific crime. At approximately 9:03 p.m., ship security and medical personnel finally arrived at the cabin and immediately began attempting to perform life-saving measures on Kristy. They worked desperately to revive her, using every technique and piece of equipment available to them on the cruise ship. However, their efforts were unsuccessful, and it quickly became apparent that Kristy's injuries were too severe for her to survive. It was officially determined that Kristy Manzanares had been killed by blunt force trauma to her head and face. The medical examination revealed the full extent of the violence that had been inflicted upon her. Injuries so severe and numerous that they painted a picture of an assault that had continued long after she would have lost consciousness and been unable to defend herself. Kenneth was immediately taken into custody by ship security personnel, who found him covered in his wife's blood and showing no signs of remorse or emotional distress over what he had done. His demeanor was described as eerily calm and detached, as though he was disconnected from the reality of the situation and the horrific crime he had just committed. As the ship's crew worked to secure the crime scene and tend to the traumatized family members, the Emerald Princess was approximately 7 miles away from the coast of Forester Island, placing it firmly within U.S. federal jurisdiction. This location would prove to be significant, as it meant that Kenneth would face federal charges for his crime, rather than being subject to the laws of any particular state. The cruise ship, which had been filled with passengers enjoying their Alaskan vacation, was suddenly transformed into a crime scene. Passengers reported hearing announcements over the intercom about a domestic altercation, and the fear and uncertainty in the voice of the crew member making the announcement was evident to those who heard it. Chris Seaman, a passenger who was staying in a room across from the Manzanares family, later told reporters that he heard one of the little girls calling for help and saying that her parents had been in a fight. He described her as sounding pretty desperate and noted that the crew responded as quickly as they could to assist. On July 26, 2017, the day after Kristy's murder, Kenneth Ray Manzanares was formally arrested and taken into federal custody. He would remain in custody from that day forward, as the severity of his crime and the flight risk he posed made bail impossible. The FBI immediately launched a comprehensive investigation into the murder, conducting approximately 200 interviews with passengers and crew members who had been aboard the Emerald Princess during the incident. The investigation revealed the full scope of the violence that Kenneth had inflicted upon his wife. Federal prosecutors determined that Kenneth had used his fists as weapons, delivering blow after blow to Kristy's head and face in what they described as an unrelenting assault. The attack had been so violent and sustained that it suggested Kenneth had completely lost control and was determined to kill his wife. During the investigation, FBI agents searched Kenneth's belongings and conducted interviews with him about the events leading up to the murder. At one point during the investigation, when agents were searching Kenneth for physical evidence, he spontaneously made a statement that further demonstrated his consciousness of guilt. He said, "My life is over," a comment that prosecutors would later cite as evidence that he understood the gravity of what he had done. As news of the murder spread beyond the cruise ship, it shocked the Santa Clara, Utah community where Kenneth and Kristy had lived and raised their family. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues who had known the couple were stunned by the revelation that Kenneth had killed his wife. Many described the couple as having seemed happy and stable, with no obvious signs of the domestic violence that had culminated in Kristy's death. Family, friends, and neighbors began organizing support for Kristy's 3 daughters, who had not only lost their mother in the most traumatic way possible, but had also lost their father, who would be spending the rest of his life in prison. A family friend named Nichols, who had worked with Kristy in real estate, started a GoFundMe campaign to provide financial support for the girls. He described Kristy as a wonderful, beaming ray of sunshine, and emphasized that the focus needed to be on supporting the children whose worlds had been turned upside down. On February 7, 2020, Kenneth Ray Manzanares pleaded guilty in federal court to second-degree murder in the death of his wife, Kristy. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. They pushed for a life sentence, citing the brutal nature of the attack, while the defense asked for 7.5 years, pointing to Kenneth's brain injuries, low IQ, and mental health issues. On June 3, 2021, Judge Timothy Burgess sentenced him to 30 years in prison, calling the crime violent and brutal. Kristy's family said the decision brought them a sense of resolution. On July 14th, 2021, just over a month after his sentencing, Kenneth Ray Manzanares was found dead in his cell at the Lemon Creek Correctional Center in Juneau, Alaska. He was discovered unresponsive at 6:59 a.m. and was pronounced dead at 7:42 a.m. after correctional officers and medical staff attempted life-saving measures. Alaska Department of Corrections officials stated that no foul play was suspected in Kenneth's death and that it was not COVID-19 related. Kenneth's death meant that he would never serve the full 30-year sentence that had been imposed upon him. The case of Kenneth Ray Manzanares is a grim reminder of how domestic violence can turn deadly, even in seemingly loving relationships. The couple's 3 daughters now live with the lasting impact of that tragic night aboard the Emerald Princess. Her infectious smile, compassionate soul, and dedication to her daughters continue to be remembered by friends, family, and colleagues who knew her. As her obituary stated, she made everyone who came in contact with her feel important, special, and put a smile on their face. Because of that, she was adored by all, and we are all blessed to have had Kristy in our lives. With a heavy heart, we remember Kristy Manzanares as a loving mother, successful professional, and cherished family member whose life was cut tragically short by the very person who had promised to love and protect her.